The night did not feel normal. At a little past 1 in the morning, June 6, 1944, the sky over Normandy stopped being quiet. A low sound rolled in first, not thunder, not wind, a deep, mechanical hum that grew louder by the second. German officers stepped outside their command posts and looked up. The clouds were thick, the moon was gone. And yet the sound was everywhere. Engines, hundreds of them. One German major stood frozen, listening. He had survived Crete. He had fought in Africa. He had watched men die on the Eastern Front. Still, this sound made his stomach tighten. Whatever was coming was bigger than anything he had faced before. Within hours, German officers would begin writing in their diaries, not calmly, not confidently, but with confusion and fear. Because that night, American paratroopers were falling out of the sky. They did not come down in clean lines. They did not land where maps said they should. They dropped into flooded fields, into trees, into villages, into German positions themselves. Some hit the ground alone, some without weapons, some without any idea where they were. And yet, somehow, they began to win. This is why German officers wrote about American paratroopers with fear. The German army in 1944 believed in order. Plans, control. Everything had a place. Every unit had a task. War. Everything had a place. Every unit had a task. War, to them, was something you calculated. That belief shattered in the dark over Normandy. The airborne assault was supposed to be precise. On paper, it was perfect. American paratroopers would land, regroup, seize bridges, block roads, and hold until the beach forces arrived. That was the plan. Reality had other ideas. Clouds broke formations apart. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky. Pilots swerved to avoid collisions. Green lights flashed too early. Red lights came too late. Doors opened over the wrong fields. Men jumped anyway. By sunrise, thousands of American paratroopers were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. Some units lost more than half their men before they ever fired a shot. Radios were gone. Officers were missing. Equipment was sunk in marshes or hanging from trees. From a German point of view, this should have been a gift, a broken enemy. Isolated, confused, easy to destroy. That is not what happened. German sentries reported shots from hedgerows, small groups attacking checkpoints, bridges blown by men who appeared out of nowhere, phone lines cut. Runners never returned. Reports came in from every direction at once. Americans everywhere. German officers tried to understand it. Where were the main drop zones? What was the real target? How many had landed? No one could answer. One German general, trained specifically to fight airborne troops, never even reached his headquarters. Driving through the darkness, his staff car ran into an ambush. A handful of American paratroopers opened fire. In seconds, the general was dead. He became the first German general killed in the invasion. His division, meant to crush airborne attacks, was leaderless before dawn. This moment spread like a crack through the German command system. Orders stopped flowing. Decisions were delayed. Units waited for instructions that never came. The Americans did not wait. A paratrooper landed alone in a field. Gunfire echoed in the distance. He had lost most of his gear. He had no idea where he was. Then a shape appeared in the darkness, another American shouting desperately, admitting he forgot the password. They laughed. That laugh mattered. It was not fearlessness, it was refusal. Refusal to freeze, refusal to give in to panic. That attitude repeated itself again and again. Small groups formed, not by rank, by whoever spoke first, whoever moved, whoever decided, we go now. German doctrine assumed enemies behave logically. If scattered, they regroup. If outnumbered, they defend. If cut off, they wait. American paratroopers did none of that. They attacked. A dozen men moved on a German gun position firing toward the beaches. They should have waited. They did not. They crawled through trenches, threw grenades, took gun after gun. Reinforcements arrived by accident. Strangers joined the fight without orders. By morning, the guns were silent. German artillery officers wrote later that they never understood how such a small force dared to move forward. In one town, American paratroopers drifted in from all directions. Some carried rifles, some had pistols, some had knives. They took the town anyway. German defenders were overwhelmed before they could react. A flag came down, another went up. German report described it as sudden and impossible to predict. That word appears again and again in their writings. Unpredictable. German commanders were trained to read a battlefield, to anticipate, to stay one step ahead. In Normandy, they felt blind. Paratroopers were reported north, south, east, west. Some reports were real, some were not. Dummy parachutists exploded on impact, simulating gunfire. German units chased shadows for hours. One staff officer later wrote that it felt like fighting smoke. At higher headquarters, confusion turned into argument. Some believed Normandy was the main invasion. Others were convinced it was a trick. Time passed. Decisions stalled. Meanwhile, American paratroopers kept moving. They crossed flooded fields under fire. They crept through hedgerows at night. They cut throats silently. They hit roadblocks, vanished, then struck somewhere else. German soldiers began to fear the dark. One paratrooper veteran later described lying in his foxhole, hearing movement in the trees. No shots, no voices. Then a scream. A man nearby killed without warning. He spent the rest of the night shaking, knowing the Americans were out there, watching. German officers noticed something else. When American officers were killed, the fighting did not stop. Sergeants took over, then corporals, then privates. Decisions were made instantly. Attacks continued. No pause. Then privates. Decisions were made instantly. Attacks continued. No pause. No waiting for permission. German attempts to break units by targeting leaders failed. There was always another man willing to step forward. This behavior unsettled them deeply. In their diaries and reports, German officers used words like reckless, wild, aggressive, but beneath those words was something else: respect. They wrote about Americans advancing when any trained soldier would pull back, about men pushing forward despite losses, about attacks that made no sense and yet worked. One German commander expected the Americans to need days to reorganize after the drop. Instead, they attacked his positions within hours. When he later wrote about them, he admitted he had never faced an enemy like this. He had expected professionals who followed rules. He got volunteers who made their own. The chaos of the Airborne drop should have destroyed the Americans. Instead, it became their weapon. German units could not tell where the danger was greatest because danger was everywhere. Reserves meant to counterattack the beaches were stuck fighting paratroopers in their rear. Commanders hesitated, unsure where to send men. That hesitation cost them Normandy. By the end of the first day, American airborne forces had taken heavy losses. Thousands were dead, wounded, or missing. But they had done something far more important. They had broken the German response at the exact moment it mattered most. In the days that followed, German officers kept writing, trying to understand, trying to explain how scattered men had caused such damage, why control vanished so quickly, why fear spread faster than orders. They did not yet know this was only the beginning, because the Americans who survived that first night were learning fast, hardening, adapting. And the Germans were about to face them again, not falling from the sky this time, but coming straight at them. By the morning of June 7th, the Germans understood one thing clearly: the Americans were not going away. What had begun as scattered gunfire in the dark had turned into something far worse. American paratroopers were no longer just isolated shapes moving through hedgerows. They were digging in, linking up, learning the land, and most disturbing of all to German officers, they were getting better by the hour. The countryside of Normandy was not open ground. It was broken into thousands of small compartments by hedgerows' thick walls of earth topped with dense roots and bushes. Visibility dropped to a few steps. Sound carried strangely. A man could be 10 meters away and unseen. German defenders believed this terrain favored them. They had prepared positions. They knew the ground. They expected slow, cautious advances. Instead, they met Americans who crawled, listened, waited, and then struck hard. German patrols disappeared. Outposts went silent. Runners never returned. When units moved to investigate, they walked into ambushes set by men who had been in France less than 48 hours. German officers began writing about a new kind of danger, not massed attacks, not heavy armor, small groups moving fast, hitting weak points, then vanishing. One report complained that American paratroopers refused to behave like a defeated force. Another noted that even when surrounded, they attacked outward instead of surrendering. This behavior did not fit German expectations. At Carentan, the tension rose by the hour. The town mattered. It connected the American beachheads. Lose it, and the invasion gains momentum. A German paratrooper regiment elite, experienced, confident, was ordered to hold it. Its commander believed he could. He had fought across Europe. He trusted his men. They were trained to fight airborne troops. They had discipline, experience. What he did not expect was how quickly the Americans would come for him. American paratroopers advanced along narrow causeways surrounded by flooded fields. There was no cover. Machine gun fire tore into them. Men fell into water-stained dark. Still others moved forward. German officers watching through binoculars could not understand it. Any rational force would pull back, regroup, wait for armor. The Americans kept coming. They attacked houses one by one, cleared rooms with grenades and gunfire, took positions at night, fought at distances so close that orders became shouts and gestures. German counterattacks hit them hard. Artillery hammered American positions. Snipers picked men off. Yet every time the Germans thought the line would break, it held. A German officer later wrote that the Americans seemed immune to discouragement. During a brief truce to collect wounded, German and American officers spoke face to face. A surrender demand was sent. The reply came back sharp and defiant. No. The fighting resumed. Inside German headquarters, frustration grew. Ammunition ran low. Casualties mounted. Messages up the chain painted a grim picture. The Americans were not just brave, they were relentless. German units trained for precise operations found themselves reacting instead of controlling. Plans failed. Timetables collapsed. Commanders who had once issued confident orders now hesitated, unsure what waited beyond the next hedgerow. One German battalion was nearly wiped out after repeated attacks by American paratroopers who should not have even been there, according to maps. Another surrendered after days of fighting. Shocked at how aggressively the Americans pressed every advantage. When Carentan finally fell, German officers knew something important had changed. The Americans had linked their beachheads. Normandy was no longer a gamble. It was a foothold, and the men who had jumped into darkness were a major reason why. German intelligence officers studied everything they could. Captured documents, prisoner interrogations, after-action reports. They searched for patterns. What they found disturbed them. American paratroopers did not wait for perfect conditions. They did not insist on full strength. They acted when action was possible, not when it was ideal. This made them impossible to predict. German training emphasized obedience and coordination. Orders flowed downward. Initiative existed, but within limits. American airborne units functioned differently. If a plan failed, they did not stop, they adjusted. If leaders were gone, someone else took over. Decisions were made quickly, often by men the Germans would never expect to be in command. This created a kind of pressure the German army struggled to counter. You could not paralyze these units by killing officers. You could not surround them and expect surrender. You could not rely on fear to stop them. German soldiers felt it at night the most. Americans moved after dark, quiet, careful, watching, waiting, then sudden violence, a burst of gunfire, a grenade through a window, a scream cut short. A German paratrooper later described lying awake all night, finger on the trigger, heart racing, afraid to move, afraid not to. He said the Americans hunted them. That word appears more than once in German accounts. Hunted. As the days passed, American paratroopers hardened. They learned the hedgerows. They learned how the Germans set ambushes. They learned how to work with tanks, with artillery, with infantry units pushing inland. The men who landed scattered and confused were not the same men fighting a week later. German officers noticed this change quickly. Early reports describe Americans as wild and chaotic. Later reports describe them as skilled, patient, dangerous. The speed of this transformation alarmed them. One German intelligence summary warned that American airborne troops adapt faster than expected and learn immediately from contact. This adaptability became a constant theme. The Germans had expected to face amateurs with courage but little finesse. They were wrong. Months later, in the winter forests of Belgium, the lesson returned. When German armored divisions smashed into American lines in December 1944, they expected panic, retreat, collapse. Instead, they ran into familiar faces. The same airborne division that had jumped into Normandy was rushed to a frozen crossroads town called Bastogne. They arrived with little ammunition, little food, and no time to prepare. German forces surrounded them. Snow fell, temperatures dropped, supplies ran out, wounded men froze where they lay. German officers believed this time would be different. They sent a surrender demand. The American reply was short, blunt, and confusing. No. The siege continued. Artillery pounded the town. Attacks came from every direction. Still, the Americans held. Attacks came from every direction. Still, the Americans held. German officers wrote later that the defenders refused to accept reality. That refusal broke the German offensive. When relief finally arrived, German hopes in the West died with it. After the war, German officers tried to explain what they had faced. They wrote reports, gave interviews, spoke to historians. Again and again, the same ideas surfaced. American paratroopers were not superior because of equipment. Often, they were poorly supplied. They were not superior because of numbers. They were often outnumbered. They were dangerous because of how they thought. They did not treat war as something to be perfectly controlled. They treated it as a problem to solve under pressure. When one solution failed, they tried another. When logic said stop, instinct said move. This unsettled an army built on calculation. One German commander admitted he expected Americans to fight like Europeans, carefully, cautiously, according to rules both sides understood. The Americans ignored those rules. They attacked when it made no sense, advanced when losses were heavy, held ground when surrounded. They were not reckless. They were stubborn. That stubbornness spread fear. Fear not of defeat alone, but of uncertainty, of not knowing what the enemy would do next. German officers were used to predicting opponents. Against American paratroopers, prediction failed. This fear is visible in their writing. Not panic. Not hysteria. Unease. A sense that control was slipping away. The irony is that many American paratroopers did not feel fearless at all. Letters home spoke of confusion, doubt, exhaustion. Men admitted they were terrified. But they kept moving, they kept fighting, because stopping felt worse. By the end of the war, German officers understood something they had not known in 1944. The chaos they saw on D-Day was not weakness, it was strength. The Americans turned disorder into momentum, confusion into pressure, fear into aggression. That is why German officers wrote about them the way they did, not because they were perfect soldiers, but because they were impossible to break. By late summer of 1944, German officers no longer asked if American paratroopers were dangerous. They asked how to survive them. Normandy had become a grinding nightmare. Every hedgerow felt watched. Every tree line felt alive. German units moved cautiously now, slower than doctrine allowed, slower than the situation demanded. The confidence that once defined the German army had been worn down by weeks of constant pressure, and much of that pressure came from men who were never supposed to fight this way. Airborne troops were meant to drop, seize key points, and hold. That was the theory. In Normandy, American paratroopers became something else entirely. They became hunters in a maze. German officers wrote about how American patrols seemed to appear from nowhere. How small units slipped through gaps that should not have existed. How supply routes thought to be secure were suddenly cut by a handful of men with rifles and grenades. One German captain noted bitterly that no rear area exists anymore. That sentence alone explains the fear. Rear areas are where soldiers rest, where wounded are treated, where commanders think. When those areas vanish, anxiety spreads fast. American paratroopers made sure they vanished. They learned to move silently through the hedgerows, to listen more than they spoke, to wait. Patience became a weapon, so did timing. German units often reported being attacked just as they were shifting positions, just as they were reorganizing, just as they felt momentarily safe. The Americans struck in those moments. This was not luck, it was learning. The paratroopers who survived the first days were no longer green. They had been tested by chaos, by confusion, by fear. Those who broke were gone. Those who remained adapted quickly. German intelligence officers noticed this pattern with growing concern. Early encounters described Americans as aggressive but disorganized. Later reports changed tone. Words like methodical, clever, and persistent appeared more often. One intelligence summary warned that American airborne units were now acting independently with high effectiveness. Independently. That word frightened German commanders. Independently. That word frightened German commanders. Independence meant no single target to destroy. No headquarters whose loss would stop the attacks. No clear rhythm to anticipate. When German officers attempted counterattacks, they often found Americans already repositioned. When they tried to encircle units, the units slipped away or attacked outward with surprising force. German casualties rose steadily. Morale fell just as steadily. Letters home from German soldiers began to change. Confidence gave way to fatigue. Boasts were replaced by silence. Mentions of those parachute troops appeared more often. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation. German units hesitated more now. They paused before advancing. They waited longer for confirmation. They double-checked orders. In war, those seconds matter. American paratroopers exploited every one. By the time Allied forces broke out of Normandy, German officers understood something deeply uncomfortable. They were not losing because they were weaker. They were losing because the enemy refused to play the same game. This realization followed them east. In the forests, towns and river crossings of France and Belgium, German troops continued to encounter American airborne units. The pattern repeated itself. Sudden contact, close-range fighting, rapid decisions, pressure that never fully lifted. German officers tried to brief their men, warn them, prepare them. But warnings only go so far. You can train soldiers to face tanks. You can drill them against artillery. You can prepare them for air attacks. It is harder to prepare them for an enemy who does not slow down when logic says he should. As winter approached, German commanders hoped exhaustion would finally catch up with the Americans. Instead, they met them again in the Ardennes. This time, German armor punched deep into American lines, roads clogged with retreating units, confusion spread, snow and fog grounded aircraft. For a moment, it looked like the old days. Like surprise and momentum had returned to the German side. Then the paratroopers arrived. They came in trucks on foot with barely enough gear. They moved straight into the path of the advance and dug in around a crossroads town. German commanders were confident. The Americans were confident. The Americans were surrounded. Supplies were cut. The weather favored the attackers. Logic said surrender was only a matter of time. So they sent a message. The reply shocked them, not because it was clever, but because it showed the same stubborn spirit they remembered from Normandy. Refusal, no negotiation, no delay, just refusal. German officers later admitted that this response had a powerful effect on morale. It told them the Americans did not see the situation the same way. Where the Germans saw encirclement, the Americans saw a position to hold. Where the Germans calculated attrition, the Americans measured resolve. The fighting around the town was brutal. Shells fell day and night. Food ran low. Wounded men suffered in freezing conditions. Still, the Americans did not break. German soldiers reported counterattacks launched in snowstorms, patrols probing outward even while surrounded, aggression that made no sense on paper, It felt familiar, too familiar. Veteran officers recognized it instantly. "This is Normandy again," one is reported to have said. When the encirclement finally broke and German forces were forced to pull back, something hardened inside the German officer corps. They had now seen this enemy twice under impossible conditions, and twice the enemy refused to quit. After the war, when German officers sat in quiet rooms answering questions for historians, this was the part they struggled to explain, not the tactics, those could be studied, not the weapons, those could be counted, but the mindset. Why did American paratroopers keep attacking when logic said stop? Why did they hold when retreat made more sense? Why did chaos seem to energize them instead of destroying them? Some German officers blamed culture. Others blamed training. A few blamed chance, but many admitted the truth was simpler. These men believed they could win, even when everything said they shouldn't. That belief was contagious. It spread through American units. It unnerved German ones. Fear is not always about death. Soldiers accept death as part of war. Fear grows when certainty disappears. American paratroopers erased certainty. That is why German officers wrote about them the way they did. That is why their words still carry weight decades later. They were trying to warn those who came after. Trying to explain that some enemies are dangerous, not because they are flawless, but because they refuse to stop moving forward. By early 1945, German officers no longer wrote reports filled with theory. They wrote reports filled with resignation. The war had turned decisively against them. But it was not just the loss of territory that weighed on their minds. It was the growing sense that, no matter where they tried to stabilize the front, certain American units would arrive and make stability impossible. Among those units, the airborne divisions stood out. German commanders noticed something disturbing. Even after months of constant combat after Normandy, after Holland, after the Ardennes, American paratroopers did not fight like exhausted men. They fought like men who expected hardship. This expectation changed everything. Most armies slow down as fatigue accumulates. Decision-making becomes cautious. Initiative fades. German officers had been trained to look for these signs. They expected them. They rarely found them. Instead, American airborne units continued to probe, harass, and advance with a tempo that felt wrong. Their patrols remained aggressive. Their defenses remained flexible. Their reactions were fast, sometimes alarmingly so. German officers began to describe them as unpredictable. Unpredictability is poison to planning. By this stage of the war, German doctrine relied on careful calculation. They needed precision because they no longer had reserves to waste. Every counterattack had to matter. But how do you calculate against an enemy who refuses to behave predictably? Attempts to lure American paratroopers into traps often failed. When German units pulled back deliberately, expecting pursuit, the Americans sometimes stopped short, waited, and struck somewhere else entirely. When German commanders massed forces for a decisive blow, airborne patrols found the concentration early and disrupted it before it could unfold. German reports increasingly used phrases like pressure from all directions and constant contact. Constant contact drains an army faster than defeat. Sleep vanished. Rest became impossible. Even quiet sectors felt tense, as if violence might erupt at any moment, and often it did. The psychological strain was immense. German soldiers spoke of never knowing where the Americans were, only that they were close. Every rustle in the woods, every movement near a hedgerow, every shadow at dusk carried the same thought. They could be there. This sense of omnipresence gave American paratroopers a power far beyond their numbers. It also changed how German officers evaluated risk. Positions that might have been held earlier in the war were now abandoned sooner. Movements that once seemed safe were delayed or cancelled. Commanders grew defensive, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. One German officer later admitted that fighting American airborne troops felt like being hunted rather than fighting a battle. That statement reveals more than any casualty figure ever could. As the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, German resistance became increasingly fragmented. Units were under strength. Communications were unreliable. Fuel and ammunition were scarce. Yet even in this chaos, German officers tried to regroup. They planned defensive lines along rivers and towns. They hoped terrain would compensate for what they lacked in men and material. Then the paratroopers appeared again. They crossed rivers under fire. They seized bridges and high ground. They moved fast enough to deny the Germans time to settle into prepared defenses. German officers wrote about how quickly American airborne units transitioned from assault to defense, from movement to entrenchment. This flexibility shocked them. Traditional infantry needed time to dig in, to reorganize. The paratroopers seemed to do it instinctively, as if chaos was their natural state. One after-action report described an American airborne battalion that captured a position in the morning and had it fortified by afternoon, repelling multiple counterattacks before nightfall. The German officer who wrote the report noted, almost incredulously, that the Americans showed no visible confusion throughout the process. By April 1945, the end was near. German officers knew it. Their men knew it. Resistance continued, but belief in victory was gone. Still, many German units fought on not because they thought they could win, but because surrender to some enemies felt worse than fighting. When asked after the war which Allied troops they least wanted to face in those final weeks, many German officers gave the same answer. American paratroopers, not because they were cruel, not because they were invincible, but because they were invincible, but because they applied pressure until the very end. Even when the outcome was certain, this relentlessness left a lasting impression. In post-war interviews, German officers struggled to put it into neat categories. They could analyze Soviet mass, British discipline, American industrial power, but the airborne units didn't fit cleanly into any of those explanations. They were small, aggressive, adaptive, and mentally hard. One German general summarized it bluntly. With these men, the situation never felt under control. That loss of control defined the German experience against American paratroopers. War is fought with weapons, but it is decided by minds. And by 1945, the German mind was tired. It had been worn down not only by bombs and tanks, but by an enemy that refused to give it a moment's peace. That is why, decades later, German officers still spoke about American paratroopers with a certain respect. They had not just been defeated, they had been outlasted, and in war, that difference matters more than anything else.